Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'll tell you about the relative value of all the chess pieces. It's really important. And so is the second part of the lesson, when I'll talk about how to use your king and how not to use it. Let's get started. Here is our first example where we see just pawns on the board. Each pawn is worth 1 point on a point scale. Therefore, in this position, we would consider black being up 2 points. That is, up 2 pawns. Having material advantage generally is a big advantage and most of the time leads to winning the game. Let's move now to the strongest piece on the board, that is the queen. The queen is the highest value of all the pieces, would be worth 9 pawns, although as we know, in a chess game there can only be 8 pawns at any given time. Also, you can notice the queen in this case being right in the middle of the board, and from there it can reach 27 squares. That's a lot of squares, and that's one of the reasons why the queen is the most valuable pieces of them all. Moving on to the next most valuable piece, the rook. Here again centralized. The rook is worth equal to 5 points, or in other words, 5 pawns. The rook is also very valuable. From its central location, it can reach 14 different squares. Although I'd have to mention that it would do the same even if the rook would be in the corner on A1. The rook is not a piece that needs to be centralized. The rook is a long-range piece that usually is just as effective from a far distance than being close to the actual target. In fact, oftentimes, it's safer to keep the rook far away, out of harm's way, and yet accomplish the goal of an attack. Let's move on to the next piece, the bishop or the knight. In the position you see in front of you, white has a knight, while black has a bishop. Each of those pieces are worth 3 pawns, or 3 points. So we went through pretty much all the pieces that we play with in chess. Except for the king, the kings have no point value. The kings are kind of like the goal of the game to checkmate the king. The king generally is not an attacking piece, although sometimes it may be used for an attack, which I'll get back to later towards the end of the lesson. Let's see now a couple of more complex situations. The position we see on the screen right now, white has a queen and a pawn. Well, if you add up those numbers, the queen and the pawn together, 9 plus 1, is worth 10 points. And so are the 2 black rooks. 5 plus 5 equals 10 just as well. So typically this would be considered, although unbalanced, but still equal position materially. Let's see another unbalanced but equal material situation. In this case, white has a knight equaling 3 points or 3 pawns, plus 2 additional pawns, 3 plus 2 equaling 5. Again, the same value as a sole rook that black has. Also, it could be another kind of balance between the 2 bishops and the knight, each equaling 3 points, versus a queen that equals 9. Again, 3 times 3 equals 9. Of course, we could have many more examples, but the bottom line is the same. You need to be very clear about the value of each piece, and you constantly need to keep that in mind when you have situations of exchanging one piece for another, to make sure you don't exchange a more valuable piece for a less valuable one. Let me show you, for example, situations when the trade, the exchange, is just a fair, equal trade, like in the example we see in front of us now. In this position, white, being on move, could capture black's queen, but it's not a gain because black right away could recapture with his pawn, and this would be just a simple exchange, a simple trade that, materially speaking, would not favor either side. Whether you'd want to trade or rather keep your queens on the board, it would be determined rather by some other elements. Whether would you have an attack, or do you like to play with your queens more than without? And it may be a subjective decision or decided by strategical elements. At this level, typically, it's a matter of taste. And the only thing I'd suggest that if you're ahead in material, which in this case you're not, neither side is, whoever is ahead, let's say having an extra rook or bishop or even just a little pawn, typically that side would be looking to exchange pieces of equal value. And the other side, the one behind, would be looking how to avoid the exchange of pieces. Let's move on to our next example. Here we are. In this position, white has an option to exchange his bishop and knight for black's queen. Of course, it's not a very difficult math to understand that a bishop and a knight, 3 plus 3 equaling only 6, is less than what a queen is worth, that is 9 points. Therefore, it's clearly in white's interest in this position to accomplish that. Try to sit back for a moment and figure out what may be that move that forces black to give up his queen in return for white's bishop and knight. Well, the correct move in this position is moving the bishop to d5, giving a check. Now, if the black king moves out of the check, then the situation gets even worse because the white bishop will simply capture the black queen for free. Therefore, the best that black can do here is to capture that white bishop with his queen, but the problem is that allows the white knight to capture the black queen on d5, and after king captures knight on d5, white accomplished the goal, winning black's queen for giving up less material, only a bishop and knight, reaching a won endgame where white has an extra pawn. Let's see another example where white has the opportunity in this position to win material again. As we learned, the bishop is of lesser value than a rook. Therefore, in this case, capturing black's rook on d6 is clearly a good move. It gains material, even though black can also capture our bishop, but white won 2 points by this exchange. When one side gives up a bishop or a knight for a rook, that's being called winning an exchange. just like the word exchange, like exchanging something. This is a special term, though, for winning a rook while giving up a bishop or a knight. Let's move on to the next position. Let's see what should white do here. White has an opportunity to capture several of black's pieces. White also has the opportunity to give checks in various ways. I'd like to point out that in general, giving a check in itself does not accomplish anything. At times, it doesn't hurt either. At yet another times, it may be a great intermediate move. And in this case, it would be a mistake straight out. First of all, let's discuss the capturing possibilities. White has an option to either capture the bishop on e5 or the rook on c5. Normally, when we have a choice, we always want to capture the opponent's more valuable piece. And I bet you know by now which one it is in this case. Of course, yes, the rook. The rook is quite a bit more valuable than the bishop. The rook is worth 5 points compared to the bishop's only 3. Therefore, capturing the bishop in this case would only be an exchange of equal value pieces. The bishop and the knight are both worth only 3 points. On the other hand, if white captures the rook on c5, by the way with a check, although it's not an important issue in this case, even after black captures the white knight, white still gained quite a bit. White gained an exchange that is gained 2 points. Let's go back to the starting position for a moment because I would like to point something else out. Oftentimes, inexperienced players like to give a check. They are proud to make a move like this and say, check. I have to say that in this case, this would be an outright error. The reason for that is because black, in addition to moving his king out of the check, in which case it wouldn't really matter because the knight then would still have the option to capture the rook. But in addition to moving the king, black has an alternate, a better option, namely to move his rook away from harm's way and block the check and initiate an equal trade between the two rooks. The same would happen if in the starting position, white would give the check from the other side from b1. In that case, again, black would not move his king out of check, but would block the check with the rook on b5, which is a safe square as the pawn on a6 was guarding the rook, and again result in an equal trade and staying healthy in the game. So again, remember, the correct move was knight capturing the rook in this position. Let's talk for a moment about knights and bishops. I already mentioned that the bishops and the knights are of equal value of 3 points each. When we have a bishop in the middle of the board, from where it can control the most number of squares, it can guard attack up to 13 squares. While a knight, at best, it can only reach 8 squares, even if it's optimally centralized. However, the disadvantage of a bishop is that bishops are restricted to squares of only one color, while knights can reach any square on the entire chessboard, and in addition, knights are the only pieces that can jump over any other piece. So as you can see, there are advantages to both of those pieces, and that's how they balance out. Talking about pawns, pawns have the least value compared to all the other pieces. In fact, oftentimes when we are talking about pieces in chess, we are only referring to all other pieces but pawns. Nevertheless, when we speak about the chess pieces, we include all the pieces, including the pawns and the kings. The pawns at best can control only 2 squares at a time. Therefore, pawns are typically used to protect the king. Of course, in endgames, when most of the other valuable pieces are already off the board, pawns can have great potential, being the only piece with the right and hope to become a queen. Other than checkmating in chess, which usually doesn't happen until later part of the game, material is the most important thing in chess. Typically, the side that has material advantage will eventually win the game. At a professional level, for example, when a grandmaster loses a piece, let's say loses a knight or a bishop, they would resign the game against another experienced player, master or grandmaster. However, in between two new players, losing a piece, even sometimes losing a more valuable piece, such as a rook or a queen, may only be a small accident. There is a strong possibility that the opponent may return the favor and also be generous and make another blunder. Therefore, if you make a mistake and lose a piece, just keep fighting on. Learn from it and make sure you try to avoid the same mistake the next time. Let's move on to our next example. The position that we see on the board now tries to demonstrate what we mean by keeping our kings safe. As you can see, white has castled to the queen side of the chessboard, and black has castled to the king side on the chessboard. The 3 pawns in front of the castling position are there to guard the king. And we usually want to keep mostly those pawns there. Time to time, we may want to move just one little pawn up, typically the H pawn, to give a little air for the king, to avoid a special type of checkmate danger on the back rank, and the back rank problems we'll talk about at another lesson. But other than moving that H pawn up one square, generally we'd want to keep those 3 pawns right in front of the king, making sure it will be safe. The same goes for the white 3 pawns in front of the castling position on the other side. Let's move on to another example. Let's see a short game how black should not be playing, how a king should not be used. So far, everything starts fine. Both sides are doing fine so far. And now, black made a very silly move. Moved his king. We do not want to move our king at the early part of the game. The only place we want to move our king is towards the corner when we castle. If you have to move with your king and give up your right to castle, it's usually a bad sign in the beginning of the game. And to do it voluntarily is outright silly. You should not do that. I'll try to show you all the big dangers that the king can get to when it just walks around in the middle of the board, while still all the pieces are on the board. From the other side, of course, the question is, how do we take advantage of it? And that's an important lesson. It's very important that you take advantage of your opponent's mistakes before they correct it. In such a situation, you'd want to open the files and the diagonals for your queen and bishops as soon as possible. And that's exactly what White is doing here with his next move. By this move, White not only opened the diagonal of the dark squared bishop on c1, but also opened the file, the d file, for the white queen. And that is why the pawn on d4 is completely safe. If the black pawn would capture white's pawn, the queen would just capture back. Black made another mistake in this position. Black moved the king to e6, moving further out to the middle of the board. This is a definite no-no. This is something not to do. The reason I'm showing it to you, so first of all, you know what not to do, and perhaps even more importantly, to know how to take advantage of your opponent's potential mistakes. So here, White captures the pawn on e5, and Black bravely, or rather mistakenly, recaptured the pawn on e5. And now White actually can force checkmate in 3 moves. What do I mean when I say force checkmate? It means that Black has no other legal moves than what he has, which allows the checkmate in 3 moves from now. The first check is moving the queen to d5. If you look carefully, you will notice that in this position, the black king only has one legal move. The f4 square is guarded by white's bishop, and the other squares are also controlled by the other white pieces, the knight on c3, pawn on e4, and of course the queen on d5. So the only legal move is to move the king back to f6. In this position, White has many good moves, including, for example, winning the black queen by giving a check and then capturing the queen. Yet, that would not be the most efficient, best move from this position. Here, the best move is that actually forces checkmate. Because ultimately, the goal of the game is not just to win material, but rather to checkmate. That's when you win the game. To win material is only the road to win, but if you can checkmate first, of course, it's a priority. So the correct move here is queen to f5 check, which leaves the black king only one free square to go to on e7. And now, try to sit back and figure out where is that checkmate, where is that deadly attack. And the answer is, the only correct answer is, moving the queen to e5, checkmating black's king. Well, I hope this was a good lesson. Why not to use your king early in the game, and how to punish your opponent if he or she does. Let's move on to a final example that's a very famous game called the Damiano Defense. It starts again with customary moves, good moves, and in this position, Black played f6, which is an inferior move to better moves such as knight c6. The example I'm showing now will illustrate that even in situations when your opponent doesn't voluntarily walk around with his king in the beginning of the game, there are situations when it's worth sacrificing a piece, a knight, or maybe sometimes even a more valuable piece, in order to force the opponent's king to walk around. And you'll see what I mean in this example. White, in such an early stage of the game, can sacrifice a knight for just a pawn, exactly for the purpose to chase the black king out from its safety. Here it's already a straight-out mistake to capture the knight. You'll see in a minute why. Another thing I mentioned in one of the earlier lessons, that it's not a good idea to move with your queen early in the game. This is an exception to that, when a queen can and should be used already on the fourth move because the opponent made a mistake and there is a very good attacking opportunity. Of course, after a sacrifice, the attack has to be followed up. Otherwise, White would have just stayed material down. After this check, Black has two options: either to move the king out of check or block the check with the pawn from g7. If Black would block the check with the pawn, White would end up capturing a second pawn, giving a check, and in fact, moreover, it's not just a check, but also a fork, attacking the black rook in the corner. Therefore, White would end up winning significant material. Let's move back and see what happens after Black moves out of the check with his king. White now can capture a second pawn. So this already means that the sacrificed material is minimal. Sacrificing a knight for 2 pawns means that the sacrifice was really only 1 point of a sacrifice. Black moves the king out to f7, which was the only legal move. And White brings a next piece to the attack with a tempi, with a check. Black moves the king out to g6. And again, we have to be aggressive, energetic, keep giving checks to that king before it would get hope to go back somehow to the corner of the board, hiding behind his pawns. King has only one place to move to h6, and again a forceful move, d4. It seems like we moved our pawn, and not clear why is this an aggressive move. In reality, it introduced the bishop, that's highlighted with green, to the game because this is a discovered check. Even though we moved our pawn, the bishop from c1 is checking Black's king. Black has to block the check as the king has no way out. And now, a somewhat quiet move, but a very important one, that involves the white rook in the corner on h1 into the game. Black is in pretty much a lost position already. This sample game ended the following way. Black played d6, creating a counterattack on the white queen, but White has time not to move his queen from the attack, but create a double check. To the black king, a check from two directions, from both the white pawn as well as the rook in the corner, forcing the black king to move back to g7. And now, again, it's time to stop for a moment and figure out how and where can white checkmate on the next move. Hopefully you found a solution, and if you thought the solution is queen to f7, you were right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and we'll be back to learn again next week. Take care until then. Bye-bye.